If you're about to take A&P1, you're reviewing for the test, or you're just interested in the body, you are in the right place. You see, this is going to be an entire overview of the course, but instead of doing boring terminology review, we're going to use 3 case studies that will literally explain every single topic you need to know in this course. Hey everybody, Organized Biology here, where we make difficult biology concepts simple. Now before we move on, I want to mention, I'm going to be going through a lot of beautiful diagrams in this class. If you email organizedbiology@gmail.com and actually put in the title Anatomy Notes, send that email and I will immediately send you a carbon copy of all the diagrams we use in this course. So if you're interested, go ahead. Now let's get started. Now, with these 3 case studies, playing a soccer match, jumping into a frozen lake, and watching fireworks, all of them have to do with a lot of topics in A&P1. But some of them are not included, including these main things. So I'm going to briefly talk about what you're going to go over in the course so you can have a bigger picture of what you need to know. So the first thing, obviously, is this name. You may not even know what anatomy and physiology is. If you don't, anatomy simply just refers to the structures of the body. Okay, so just like the hand, the foot, the heart, all of these are structures. And looking at the structures, you can usually assume the function, right? So just like you can look at this marker and know it's meant to write on a whiteboard and not, hit a nail into some wood, you know the structure fits its function, right? Same thing here. The anatomy of the body determines the what? The physiology, because physiology refers to function. So before anything, just look at the picture of the thing. You can usually infer what it does. Pretty cool. Now, directional terms. So these will be most important in the lab side of the class because you're going to be defining where things are, but we're not going to cover that because we're primarily going to talk about the function rather than the structures of the body. Now, moving on to organ systems and the topics that you'll cover in the class. First off, I want to tell you a quick story. When I was in graduate school, I took a course with a doctor. Her name was Dr. Mins, and I called her cruel Dr. Mins because every single time I would hop onto the Zoom during COVID times, and she would come on and she said, hey, you have 20 seconds to name all of the organ systems of the body. And it stressed me out a lot. So I literally nicknamed her cruel Dr. Mins. So I'm going to write that down real quick just for fun. Okay, so why am I talking about this doctor that I had in college? Well, if you look at the first letter of all of these, you would actually get the 11 organ systems of the body. So for example, C stands for cardiovascular, R, respiratory, urinary, endocrine, lymphatic, digestive, and respiratory. Now the reason I'm cruising through those is because these are all covered in Anatomy and Physiology 2, which I will have a review video for soon, so just check back and it might be right here. However, in your class, A&P1, we're primarily going to be focusing on the Mins aspect, okay? So the 4 organ systems you are going to be covering and we're going to be discussing today are the muscular system, the M, so basically all of the cells of your body that contract. We're going to be talking about the integumentary system, so your hair, skin, and nails. We're going to be talking about the nervous system, the one that makes my students the most anxious, pun intended. And then lastly, the skeletal system. So basically all the bones and the joints. So all in all, your class doesn't really cover a whole lot of organ systems because we need to build a foundation. The first 5 chapters of the class, which usually are some sort of intro, will usually have chemistry, to which all of you say, usually boo, but we'll make it fun. We'll also have cells. We need to understand how the cells work, to understand how the body works, and then tissues, which is just clusters of those cells. And again, we're going to mention all of these as we go along in this. Now, I want to give you a bonus. This will help you understand everything. So, way back when, you were this. Can you see that on there? I'll zoom in real quick. This was you at one point. You were at one point one cell. You were one cell. Anybody know how that came to be? How you came to be? Well, I'm not going to teach about the birds and the bees today, but one sperm, one egg, male, female, came together and created that one cell. We call that cell a zygote, okay? Now, from there, what happened to that zygote? Well, if you are breathing and watching this right now, you clearly took that one cell and you divided it into 2, and then divided it into 4, and then divided it into 8, and so forth and so on, all the way until you look like this. Well, a lot more complex, but now you are a living, breathing, 30 trillion cell human being. 30 trillion cells. My question is, How did that one cell know exactly what to do in order to turn into 30 trillion cells that contract, that move, that sense, that send signals, that do all sorts of things? I don't know. I want you to know, if you get nothing else from this video, that you are a living, breathing miracle. And I don't mean that lightly. You are a living, breathing miracle. We try to understand how this process happens, but it just pales in comparison to the complexity of what actually needs to happen. So I would encourage you, go read something called Psalm 139, verse 13 through 14. It explains how God literally knit you together in your mother's womb. And it is a privilege to even be able to study this amazing topic. So whether or not you agree with me, Jesus loves you. He's made your body beautifully, fearfully, wonderfully, and you are a miracle. So let's get started in this course. Okay, so we've got Anatomy Man here. He's going to be playing in a soccer match. We're going to talk about what's happening in his muscles, in his nervous system, in his joints, all sorts of things. But in order to understand it first, we need to look at the cellular level. Remember, the functional unit of your body, 30 trillion of them, and we need to know what they're made of, right? So think about how Anatomy Man likely prepared for this match. He probably ate some good food, right? Maybe a well-balanced diet. He probably had some fats, maybe from some nuts, and then maybe he ate some protein, so like some steak. So he ate some proteins, and then he finally had some carbohydrates, most likely, to give him that burst of energy so he could prepare for that exercise that he was going to do. Now, that being said, where did all of these go? Well, obviously went into his stomach, into his intestines, but then he absorbed them specifically into his bloodstream. Now, something you need to remember for all of your A&P courses is that the blood goes everywhere. So I want you to write the blood goes everywhere. What do I mean by that? Well, the blood goes everywhere. That means it goes to every single cell of your body, basically. Okay, so all 30 trillion cells, the blood is going to be delivering things to them and also taking things away from them. It's a really key concept for homeostasis. Now, if we look then at the blood, we said he ate some fats, digested them, threw them into his bloodstream. He had some proteins and carbs, digested them, threw them into the bloodstream. Okay? Now, that being said, look at the cell, right? Do you see how this cell, okay, this is just a generic cell. It's going to look a lot different here in a second with the muscle cell. It's got proteins, right, in the membrane. It's also got proteins inside of the cell itself. You've got the fats forming something called the cell membrane on the outside. I'll point to that. It's a cell membrane made of primarily fats and cholesterol. And then you've also got those carbohydrates on the inside, kind of floating around a little bit. And these are primarily used for energy, although they have other functions. So in preparing for his soccer match, he ate food and then built, quite literally, his cells from the food that he ate. But I want to point out first that how did he build this cell in the first place? Well, we know in A&P1, you're going to cover something called protein synthesis. Protein synthesis. This is basically how your cells build themselves, and they do that by taking the nucleus here with all of its DNA. So we've got DNA in the nucleus. That DNA will be transcribed onto something called mRNA. That mRNA will go to things called ribosomes. It'll get read and then turn into all of those different proteins that are in your cells. So your cells read the DNA, produce the proteins to build themselves. In a second, we're going to talk about a couple different proteins called myosin and actin in the muscle cells. Myosin and actin, you notice both end in IN, generally proteins end in IN. That's a key term for you. So how did the muscle cell know how to do it? Once again, the nuclei of the muscles read the DNA, transcribed it onto mRNA, and then eventually made the protein at the ribosome. So that's how we build our cells. And he was only able to do that by eating that food. Okay, now secondly, not only do we need to do protein synthesis, but we also need to do something called cell respiration. That literally translates to cell breathing, but I want you to know that cell respiration ends in something called ATP production. Okay, so Anatomy Man's going to be making a lot of that molecule ATP. Think of ATP as basically the cell currency of energy. Currency of energy. We need energy in order to do all sorts of things like contract muscles and send signals from the brain and the spinal cord. How do we get ATP then? Well, we know that the carbohydrates in your bloodstream can cross into what's called the interstitial fluid right outside the blood, pass through a protein channel, and get into the cell. Same thing with the amino acids, lipids just pass right through. But we're going to focus on the carb. We're going to say that this carbohydrate is something called glucose, finds its way into the cell, and then it's going to go and get split up to a lot of things. But we also need one other ingredient. We need oxygen. That's that molecule O2, two atoms of oxygen bound together. Oxygen will also come in directly through that cell membrane, and they are going to, in a way, converge into that mighty, you've probably known it already, mitochondria. So, all right, mitochondria here. Mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, quote unquote, is where glucose and oxygen and some derivatives of glucose will combine together and eventually form that ATP. Okay, so what is that? That is something called cell respiration, specifically aerobic with oxygen cell respiration. That is the most common in all of your cells, and we'll actually see that here in the muscle cells. We got mitochondria, we need those two components. So think about it. Where'd you get the glucose? From your food, your carbohydrates. Where'd you get the oxygen? Well, you know that you breathed it into the lungs. Where do you think it went when you breathed it into the lungs? Into the bloodstream, right? Now, what's interesting, and we're going to connect this here in a second, is the cells will make a byproduct in this process called CO2. So this cell is going to produce something called CO2 that will also get back into the bloodstream. We're going to see what that does to the body here in a second, okay? Now, let's move on into some more interesting things. So let's zoom out, okay? So we talked about a cell. Let's zoom out, talk about what Anatomy Man does during a soccer match. Well, obviously, he's going to be running a lot. So let's focus on those muscle contractions. How is he contracting all sorts of muscles? Well, we're going to look specifically at his quadriceps, okay? So the muscles of the quad. And we're also going to look at the bones and the joints and the tendons and all that sort of thing in that area. But let's focus first on how the muscle contracts. Well, the muscle will contract because inside of the muscle, I'm zooming in here, we have a bunch of things called muscle fibers. So this whole thing is called a muscle fiber, but another name for that is actually just a muscle cell. Okay, muscle cell, muscle fiber, same exact thing. And you've got millions inside of a big muscle, okay? Now, if you look at the muscle fiber, we've made these proteins, right, that actin and myosin and a variety of others you can learn about in the sliding filament theory. But if you look at the lines, these striations, these are, once again, striations. And what they will do essentially is get closer together, kind of like an accordion. So if these get closer together all the way throughout the muscle fiber, in reality it's all the way through, the whole muscle will contract. So you'll be able to pick up your leg essentially if you contract that quad, right? And extend that tibia, that bone over there. So when do we tell this muscle cell to contract? Remember, if you're doing something, it's because your cells are doing something. So what's happening here? Well, we know that the muscles, the skeletal muscles that are attached to the bones, are controlled by a division of the nervous system called the somatic motor division. Okay, so I'm going to write that here real quick. Somatic motor division. That is the division of the nervous system that will communicate with skeletal muscles. So I'm going to say nervous system that stimulates skeletal muscles. All right, very good. You probably learned that before if you've taken this class. Now, what's cool about this division of the nervous system is that you can consciously control it. You can consciously control this one. How do you do that? Well, it's pretty fascinating. You have neurons up here in the cortex of the brain, so kind of the outermost part of the brain. So here's your brain, by the way. Here is another structure called the cerebellum. We'll talk about that in a second. So this is cerebellum in the back of the brain. You've also got your hypothalamus here. So I'm going to write hypothalamus. That'll come important here in a second. And then below that, you've got your whole spinal cord. This is your whole spinal cord. This creates your central nervous system. It's right in the center, as you saw over here, of your body. And we're talking first, we'll talk about these guys in a second, Talking first about the cells that talk to the skeletal muscles. They're part of the somatic motor division. So how does this work? Once again, we're going to look at a cell called a neuron. Now, a neuron, I'm just going to draw really simply, is a cell that's going to send and receive signals. So this is your stereotypical neuron, okay? Neurons got three main parts. You've got dendrites that will detect information. You've got the soma, that's going to be the cell body, and then you're going to have the axon, the signaling branch that's going to send that signal. We're going to primarily focus on the axon in this case. When the neuron sends its signal, it's actually going to go from a negative charge inside the cell due to negatively charged ions like chlorine and proteins inside the cell, and it's going to get positive. When it gets positive, it sends that signal, and we're going to release actually a chemical that will communicate with something. That's how all neurons communicate. They go from negative to positive and then release a chemical. We'll call that chemical a neurotransmitter. Okay, a lot of videos on this. I'm going to breeze through this. You can watch it later on. Okay, so in this case, we want to stimulate a skeletal muscle with these neurons. We have two neurons that are going to do this. The first one is going to be a neuron up here called an upper motor neuron, if you want to know, upper motor neuron. And it's going to come down the spinal cord and exit with a communication to a neuron down here called, you probably guessed it, the lower motor neuron. That lower motor neuron, along with other ones, will come and talk directly to that skeletal muscle. How fascinating. So we stimulate this guy, sends all the signal, releases neurotransmitter, stimulates this guy, talks to the skeletal muscle, right? Now again, we can control this process. How do we do it? Well, when we zoom in here, right, I'm zooming in on this little part, that neuron is going to come down and communicate directly with that muscle fiber. As I mentioned, that neuron comes down, it's getting positive, it's going to open up some channels, we won't talk about how, open up some channels, bring some calcium in, and it's also going to release that neurotransmitter. Okay, so here I'm going to draw that neurotransmitter in a triangle. It's also called acetylcholine if you want to know that. And it will get pushed out of the neuron to communicate with this muscle cell. So we've got that neurotransmitter out in the space. Now here's the thing. This muscle doesn't have right now any way to detect that information, right? We've got a signal here, but we don't have a receptor. And no receptor, no change. So this muscle cell needs to be able to produce proteins that are going to go to the outer part of the membrane, just like we kind of saw here, right? And it's going to connect with those triangles perfectly. Okay, so it's going to connect with those triangles perfectly. When that occurs, I'm going to skip over this whole process. When that neurotransmitter binds to our receptor, we're going to actually bring in a lot of positive charges, specifically in the form of sodium ions, like salt essentially, and that's actually going to trigger contraction of the skeletal muscle. So it's very cool how we have a lot of things at play here. We've got a cell, right, with chemicals essentially, like calcium, talking or basically pushing out other chemicals, neurotransmitters, talking to another cell, right, bringing in an electrolyte, sodium, right, that was in your blood, got around the cell, and now we're telling the muscle to contract. So you see how just in a simple contraction of your quad, there are a lot of different levels happening in order to make it contract. Very cool, right? Okay, now we're going to stick with the cell for a little bit. We talked about how these cells need two main things to produce ATP. Now, those were oxygen, right? And we also needed that glucose. I will just draw like this, a carbohydrate. So these will be able to get into the muscle cell just like any others because the muscles have a lot of blood supply. It's fantastic. And that ATP that's produced in the mitochondria, so I'm just going to draw ATP coming out of here from these two things, is directly used in that contraction, okay? So remember when I said ATP was the cellular currency of energy? We're using the currency, essentially the money of energy, to tell the muscle to contract. Now the problem is, as we continue to contract the muscle, right, as we're running in soccer, we're going to use that ATP up. So you constantly need to keep breathing in oxygen, have plenty of food essentially circulating throughout your bloodstream so that we can keep feeding the muscle cell, keep producing that ATP. Now, here's where things get interesting. As I mentioned before, we are going to begin producing CO2 into the bloodstream. So this muscle cell is going to throw a crap ton of CO2 into the blood, yes? Furthermore, as we break down ATP, so in fact, when we break down ATP, I'm not going to go through the details, we turn it into an ADP molecule and a phosphate, but more importantly, what I want you to know is we release heat in the process, okay? So we are producing byproducts, heat and CO2, and heat, I'm just going to draw as like a star, I suppose, likes to get into the blood because the blood can handle a lot of heat. So we're producing a lot of CO2, we're producing a lot of heat. Now, why is that an issue? Why is that an issue? You can probably guess. Well, with extra heat, let's say your body temperature goes from, I don't know, 98 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 37 degrees Celsius. That is your homeostatic variable. You need to keep your body at this temperature in order to stay alive. The problem is you are now dumping heat into your body. So now we'll say it goes to, say, 101 degrees Fahrenheit. Uh-oh, that's a problem. Not only that, but the CO2 in your bloodstream will actually combine with water. So it goes CO2, we add that to water, we produce an acid, we don't need to go through the details of this, called carbonic acid, and that produces a hydrogen ion, and that makes your blood acidic. So blood becomes acidic. So now, what do we have here? We've got your blood becoming acidic. You've got your body temperature at 101. Both of these things are homeostatic variables that you need to keep in a constant range in order to stay alive. You've probably learned about that or heard about that before. For blood, I'll just mention the blood pH that we need to stay in is 7.35 to 7.45. And in this case, acidic means we're going to go lower. We'll say to like 7.2. So just from exercising, do you see how we're getting too hot, we're getting too acidic? We need to do something about that to keep this anatomy man alive. Well, we know that that CO2 is the thing contributing to blood acidity. So how do we get the CO2 out of our bodies? Well, obviously, as you exercise, your respiratory rate increases. Respiratory, so your breathing rate increases to expel the CO2. Right? That's one thing that happens. And then also, you could probably guess, you got too warm. What begins happening? Well, right above here, I've drawn sweat glands. Okay, so these are your sweat glands. And obviously, as you begin getting too warm, these will begin to sweat to attempt to cool your body off. Because as you sweat, it evaporates, takes the heat with it into the air, and you cool off. But here's the thing. How did we essentially know to increase our respiratory rate and know when to begin sweating? You didn't think about it really. You just started breathing faster and you just started sweating. What happened there? Well, we know that there are branches of the nervous system that we don't consciously control, interestingly enough. So let's get into that. The next division of the nervous system, I'm going to draw in blue, and that is going to be the autonomic nervous system. So I'm going to draw it over here. We're going to call this the autonomic division. It is still a motor division because we're making an effect on tissues, but as you can probably guess, it's all involuntary. All involuntary. So what's happening here? Well, inside of the hypothalamus, we have a lot of receptors, okay? So we're going to have a lot of receptors, basically neurons, the dendrites that are detecting things. And they're going to be receptors for specifically pH and temperature. The issues here, right? pH, acidity, and body temperature. So the neurons in the hypothalamus detect that, and then they're going to stimulate a signal to do the following thing. It will send a signal to neurons that will exit the spinal cord and come and stimulate those sweat glands. And the hypothalamus will also send some signals automatically to help us breathe faster. I won't draw that on here, it might get confusing. Okay? Now, not only that, I can kind of point this out, we're also going to help trigger an increase of heart rate. So there will also be some autonomic neurons that will come and stimulate the heart to increase the heart rate during times of exercise as well. So all of these are autonomic, basically automatic functions that you don't control naturally. You don't control your sweating, you don't control your heart rate, okay? Now specifically, if you want to get into the details of this now, these are something called sympathetic neurons. Sympathetic motor neurons, okay? That stimulate the heart and stimulate sweating. However, if you think about it, after the soccer game is over, he goes into the AC, he sits down and relaxes. Does he want those sympathetic motor neurons continually keeping the heart rate up and continually sweating? Absolutely not. So what's interesting is after the sympathetic neurons have kind of done their work to get the body ready for fight or flight, we're actually going to have some things called parasympathetic neurons originating in the brainstem, and they will come around and actually decrease the heart rate and actually come, I'll draw another one, and inhibit sweating. So these, once again, are called parasympathetic neurons. We might know this as the rest and digest aspect of the autonomic nervous system. So these are parasympathetic motor neurons. Very good. So as we can see, the nervous system is quite complex in that there's some branches that we can control, somatic motor, but then there are a lot of branches that we really can't control. They're automatic, and they're going to either calm you down, parasympathetic, or stimulate you, sympathetic. Now, if you want to learn more about the nervous system as a whole, I highly recommend watching this video. I'm going to gloss over it here. But let's now focus in on the bones and the muscles here. So we're going to talk a little bit about the skeletal system and joints. So what do we have here? Well, let's talk about the joints first. Well, the joints in the skeletal system are simply where two or more bones come together. So joints are where bones come together. Now that can be as simple as the sutural bones in your skull, so where the bones in the skull connect, that's a joint technically, or it can be as complex as when the acetabulum of the hip, so the socket, connects to the ball of the femur. So again, this is the acetabulum. You don't need to know these things. And then this is the femur bone. This is a joint right here where the two bones come together. And then you get the femur connecting here to the tibia, and then you've got that patella on the front. Okay, that patella on the front. So anywhere these bones come together, we call that a joint. Now the joint that's represented from the hip socket is actually a ball and socket joint. From the femur to the tibia is something called a hinge joint, like a door hinge. And then the tibia down to the ankle, if you wanted to draw that, would actually be a condylar joint. They have different ranges of motion, but they're all different types of joints, specifically synovial joints where we have lubrication between them, we can move them a lot. Furthermore, in order to even move the bones, we obviously have our skeletal muscle here, but we also have tendons, I'll point to that, tendons that connect muscle to bone, okay? In order to keep the bones tight, however, we also have other connective tissue that will connect, say, the patella or the femur to the tibia right here. And these guys that connect bone to bone are called ligaments. So I'll write ligaments are bone to bone. Great. One interesting fact about these two structures is that they're dense, regular connective tissue. It's a type of tissue that's really strong, but it has a very low blood supply. So remember when I said blood goes everywhere? It doesn't really go to these ligaments and tendons, which means they don't heal very well. Okay, it takes a while for them to recover. Okay, so last thing with this soccer match, right? He's exercising, contracting muscles. He's doing cell respiration. He's breathing a lot. He's sweating. His heart rate is up. Finally, what's happening inside of his joints? Well, we know that we need to lubricate those joints well so he can contract the muscles well. So anytime joints come together that are very movable, so synovial joints, we're going to have several structures here. So I'm going to draw them here. We're going to have, like I said, the ligament aspects. If this were the knee, and this was like, say, the right side of the knee and the left side of the knee, okay, so we'll say this is the right knee, by the way. So we'll say right knee. And this is the right and left side, so basically the lateral side and the medial side. And we know that we've got several ligaments here. We've got a lateral collateral ligament connecting actually to the fibula out here. So there's a fibula here. We've got a medial collateral ligament here, And then we've got the anterior cruciate ligament and then the posterior cruciate ligament right behind it. All of these are ligaments connecting the femur to the tibia. So if you want to label them, I'll do that real quick. So again, LCL, MCL, ACL there, and then PCL here. So these are great at keeping the bones attached. They can obviously rupture relatively easily if we're going to move in any one direction. ACL is the most commonly torn ligament. However, what I want to focus primarily on is that synovial fluid found in between the bones. Synovial fluids. I'm going to point at that. Synovial fluid, I want you to know, is just like WD-40. Okay, it lubricates those joints so they move really well across each other. Okay, so anytime we lose some of that synovial fluid over time, your joints kind of get a little stiff. Furthermore, on that, these bones, as he's running, right, there's a lot of pressure on them, right? So we'll also have another structure padding the bones, okay? You've probably heard of this before. This is called your meniscus. You've got a medial and lateral meniscus. This is a type of fibrocartilage, okay? And think of this as like a Tempur-Pedic mattress. It's a very soft pad, but it's very firm. So it's soft but firm, right? It holds its shape well, but it gives a lot of shock absorption so that as the femur compresses into the tibia, it basically lands on that pad and it remains intact and healthy, okay? Just like you could basically sprawl out on a Tempur-Pedic mattress and it kind of supports you, but it feels really nice, right? Very cool. Last thing here, what if Mr. Anatomy Man got hit, right? Like somebody comes in and slide tackles him and he hits his bone. Well, we obviously don't want his bones to break. So what's interesting is that in his bones, on the outermost part of all of his bones, we will have a very dense structure. Okay, so I'm kind of draw it like this. On the outer part of the bone, we're gonna have very, very dense bone tissue made of a lot of collagen, a lot of calcium phosphate crystals, and that is going to be called compact bone. So I'm going to point at that and call it compact bone. That is very dense, hard bone that's going to protect from impact. However, on the inside, we're going to have a lot of scaffolding looking bone that's kind of holey. Okay, so scaffolding looking bone is kind of holey. And we quite literally call this spongy bone. So I'm going to point it up here. This is spongy bone. Spongy bone allows your bones to be lighter because there's more space inside, and there's also some marrow, like red marrow and yellow marrow. It's where we build our blood cells. But with spongy bone, there's not as much density to it, but you see how I drew those lines, right? Lines through the shaft of the bone. They are aligned in things called stress lines so that when we impact, right, as we jump or run, there's a lot of pressure on the bones, but we've got all this scaffolding that will hold that bone up and help it keep its shape. So all of these things are very important in order for Anatomy Man to play soccer. So now let's think about Anatomy Man jumping into the frigid cold water of a polar plunge. We're going to talk about a few other things like senses and other homeostatic variables as well. Okay, so now let's go into our example for the polar plunge. But before we do that, if you noticed, I'm wearing a different shirt, and you can actually get these shirts in the shop below. So get those Organized Biology merch if you so desire. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what happens when Anatomy Man dives into the water, right? So he's going horizontal and he kind of feels himself falling, right? How does he feel that, right? How does he notice that he's actually falling into space towards the water? Well, we've got to zoom into his inner ear here that I haven't drawn, but we're going to zoom in and we will see a few really cool structures inside of here. The first ones, as you can see, are kind of these half circle shaped things called semicircular canals. Semicircular because they are half circles, and they are canals. That means they're basically filled with fluid, just like a canal of water, right? Now, these are going to detect basically where his head is in space. So basically head feel is what I'm going to call it. So what can we feel here? We can feel three things. You can feel your head going down and up. In this case, for him, it's going down, right? You can also feel it going side to side and then shoulder to shoulder. Those are three planes of motion represented by three semicircular canals. Secondly, we also have the vestibular system, which is this structure here. I'll just write vestibule. And this is going to feel whole body motion, whole body motion, specifically acceleration, so speeding up and slowing down. But again, how do we feel this? How do we feel our heads moving? How do we feel our bodies kind of moving like you do when you go on an elevator or when you're falling? Well, if we zoom in on any one of these spots, we will see a cool cell literally translated to hair cell. Pretty aptly named, right? These hair cells have these projections called cilia, basically extensions of their membranes, which again are made of fats. And when we push on them, so when we're diving this way, the hairs actually get blown backwards, right? Because if you move this way, the hairs push back, right? When that happens, the cell gets excited, just like neurons do. They get positively charged, and they're actually going to release, once again, a neurotransmitter that we've talked about before. That neurotransmitter will bind to these receptors outside of the hair cell. Now this, as you can see in my key here, is connected to a sensory neuron. So we're going to label that sensory neuron. This gets into now the nervous system doesn't only basically tell things what to do like we saw in the previous example, it also detects stimuli. So this is the sensory division of the nervous system. Now this sensory neuron, as it receives that neurotransmitter, will send the signals, send the action potentials down a cranial nerve, we'll talk about more later, and it's called the vestibular or vestibulocochlear nerve. That is actually cranial nerve number 8, okay? And that cranial nerve carries sensory information about basically movement, balance, as well as hearing, we'll see later on. And it's going to find its way all the way, I'll show you, to the brainstem where it actually enters. Now, I'm going to just draw arrows here, but just know that these are neurons communicating with different things. The first place we need to send any sensory information is this structure called the thalamus. Remember from previous, the thalamus is the sorting center of information. So anytime we're getting sensory information, it's going to get sorted out at the thalamus, okay? So we're going to send that signal all the way through, and it's going to go to the thalamus. Now, from the thalamus, we can decide to send it several different places, one of which is going to be the parietal lobe of the cortex. I'm going to write parietal cortex, parietal lobe. And again, this is on the outer part of the brain, the cortex, and this is where we detect basically all general sensations like pressure, like temperature, like pain. We're going to get to those here in a second. So just know that the parietal lobe perceives, okay, so processes sensations. So what we are doing here is we are translating mechanical force, movement, to now in the parietal lobe, we're perceiving that, hey, my head is tilted and my body is falling. Okay, so we don't actually perceive that stimulus until it gets to the cortex of the brain. Very important. That is a phenomenon called sensation, which is when the stimulus acts on the receptors, versus perception, where the brain actually interprets that idea, okay, or that sensation, okay? We'll see how that gets a little screwed up later on. So now that we know that we're falling, we also need to kind of prepare our body and make sure we stay upright once we kind of hit the ground or hit the water. How do we kind of balance that out? Well, this will also send information back to a region of the brain in the back called the cerebellum. The cerebellum, I always remember, is like a ballerina. What do ballerinas need to do a lot of? They need to do a lot of balancing, and they also need to have a lot of motor coordination, okay? So basically, anytime you're holding yourself up like a ballerina, you got to have this really good coordination and balance. That's going to be coordinated by the cerebellum, kind of talking to a bunch of motor neurons to make sure that we are balancing properly. So all of that information is going to be routed to those two regions to keep us balanced and recognize that we are falling. Very cool. Now, as we move forward, we know the next problem is now we are hitting frigid cold water. That's why it's called a polar plunge, like the polar bears, right? So when we hit that water, obviously he's saying burr. What's happening here? Well, we know that his body is likely going to cool off, right? So I'm going to say over here, we're going to do a homeostatic feedback loop that we're going to follow as we go on. So homeostatic feedback loop. It's actually going to be a negative feedback loop. We'll see why later on. And we're going to say that his body temperature goes from, say, 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius, whatever unit system you use, and it's going to cool off. So it's going to go down to, say, 96 degrees Fahrenheit due to that cold water. Now we're going to take a pause on that and think. If you've ever stuck your arm or hand or whole body into frigid cold water, what do you feel immediately? Do you feel the cold or do you feel pain? Do you feel cold or do you feel pain? What's really interesting is that obviously it's cold water that you're feeling, but you perceive that cold water as painful. Why is that? Let's get to the bottom of it. Well, we know the cold that we feel has to be sensed, right? We have to have a receptor for it. And if we zoom into the body, specifically the skin, so I'm going to say this is in the skin, we'll draw it in black. We're zooming in on the skin. In the skin, we've got 3 layers real quick if you want to review or if you want to know. The top layer is going to be called the epidermis. This is a very thick layer of flattened, tough cells that are actually going to protect us from the outside environment. The middle layer is the main layer of the skin, and this is going to be called the dermis. So this main layer of the skin is the dermis, literally translating to skin, derm, just like epidermis means on top of the skin. Okay, this has a lot of connective tissue. It's got the blood supply, as you can see. It's got some sensory neurons we're going to get to here in a second. It's got a muscle, which is really cool. And then here's your hair follicle. So here's a hair follicle we'll get to in a second. Below the dermis, we have the subcutaneous layer. And this is what helps insulate us. As I drew here, these are a bunch of cells called adipocytes, literally translating to fat cells. You've got a lot of fat cells that will help insulate you, and you could probably guess, keep you pretty warm and waterproof for the most part. But we are focusing again on feeling that cold water. How do we do that? Well, you can probably guess it's going to come in the form of a sensory neuron that's in your skin. We're going to say that this sensory neuron contains receptors called thermoreceptors, along with other things. It can also feel pressure and other, like pain and that type of thing. We're going to say these are thermoreceptors, temperature receptors. And as it detects that cold, right, so here's the cold water on the skin, that cold water is going to trigger those thermoreceptors to feel that sensation of cold, right? So once again, this is a sensation, stimulus acting on the receptor. Now, as we know, we aren't feeling this yet. Where do we need to get this information in order to actually perceive it? The cortex, the parietal lobe, right? That's where we're actually going to perceive this cold. So that's exactly what's going to happen. We're going to have the sensory neuron travel through into the spinal cord, interestingly enough, okay? So we've got sensory neurons sending a signal, it's called an action potential, all the way into the spinal cord via what's called a spinal nerve. Now, the spinal nerves you see will carry sensory information, and later on we're actually going to see how it also carries motor output through the other side of the spinal nerve. We're going to stick with the sensory information first. So we've got sensory information coming into the spinal cord. Interestingly enough, it'll cross over to the other side, and we are going to send the information upward, upward, upward. Where do you think we're going to go? To the thalamus to sort out this information, right? Now, one quick thing, as we're sending long signals through the spinal cord and through the nerves, these neurons will actually be traveling through something called white matter, because that means the neuron is myelinated. Think of this as insulation, and it speeds up the signal, speeds up the action potential of the signal. Okay, it's just like insulating your wires. So all this will be white matter, and then once we're in the thalamus, it's actually going to be gray matter, because we're going to be processing in gray matter. And the gray matter will also be up here in the parietal lobe, so I'll write gray as well. So think gray processing, think white long distance signals. Pretty cool. Okay, moving on. We got it to the thalamus. Now, where's the thalamus likely going to send this information? Well, you could probably predict it's going to send it up to that parietal lobe. But remember, I said that when you hit the water, you feel pain. Why is that? Why do you feel pain? Well, we know that super extreme temperatures can actually trigger the neurons to send signals regarding pain. So how do we do that? How do we do that? Well, when this guy gets that cold, right? He gets really, really cold. We're going to send a massive amount of action potentials to this nerve into the the spinal cord, okay? So I'm just going to draw a ton of pluses. Super, super, super strong signal. That means this guy's going to send a super, super strong signal. And it's eventually going to get here, and we're going to send a super, super strong signal here. If it's a really strong signal, we actually perceive any extreme stimuli as pain. So I'm going to say pain is extreme stimuli perception. Let me give a couple other examples of this. If you've ever stuck your hand in boiling hot water before, right? You don't feel hot, you feel pain. If you've ever looked at the sun, don't do that with your retina. You actually feel pain in the back of your eye because the light is so strong, it's actually hurting the back of your eye. So any sort of strong stimulus can actually be perceived as pain if the signal is strong enough. Now, let's say the signal is weak. Let's say the temperature of the water is actually pretty warm, okay? In that case, we would send a little weaker signal. And in that case, that weaker signal will get translated not as pain, but just as temperature. Okay, so temperature is perceived when it's just a moderate stimulus, okay? So this is kind of the difference between something called sensation and perception. The sensation is just cold, but the perception can be either pain in the extreme or just temperature in the mild. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Let me know if you have any questions. I've got more videos on sensation versus perception in the description below. I'll try to link it up here. Okay, so that's what we're feeling as we get into the water. Now, that's all well and good. We're aware that we are freezing cold and it hurts. But your body is much more concerned with keeping your body temperature at this point, correct? So we need to do something to basically save Anatomy Man's life, warm him back up so that he doesn't die. So what had to happen? Well, obviously, we know that the cold water made our body cold. But now we need to send a signal specifically to a region of the brain called the hypothalamus, okay? So not only did that sensory information come into the spinal cord and go up to here, the thalamus, but we're also going to send that information to a region right here that I'm going to draw in black. We're going to say this is a very important region. This is called the hypothalamus. And I always remember the hypothalamus deals with homeostasis. Homeostasis. They both start with the letter H, okay? When that thalamus sends information about that cold to the hypothalamus will actually trigger some sympathetic output. Do you remember sympathetic from the previous video or the previous section? The sympathetic neurons deals with your fight or flight response. There's some sort of stressful stimuli coming at you, so we need to respond to it. Again, these are autonomic, so we're going to be doing this automatically. We can't control it. So what's going to happen here? Let's check it out. The first thing that the hypothalamus will do when it detects that we're really cold is it's going to send some sympathetic neurons outward, okay? I'm just going to kind of draw this like this, outward through a spinal nerve. It's actually called the sympathetic ganglion it's going to get to. And that sympathetic neuron is going to do a variety of different things. We're going to draw him going to two different places. One will be this guy right here, and one will be to these guys right here. Okay, what's happening here? Well, two things. Number one, this sympathetic neuron sends action potentials, stimulates these two structures. The first one here is called the erector pili muscle. Erector pili muscle. That literally translates to erecting or putting up a long pill-like structure. What is that structure going to be? The hair follicle right here. Kind of interesting. Hair follicle. Now the hair follicle will then get triggered by this muscle. It's a smooth muscle. I can write that here, smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle will pull that hair that direction. What will the hair then do? It will actually go straight upwards. Do you know what this is called? This is called goosebumps, y'all. So when you are cold, you get goosebumps. Why is that? I'm just going to say because you're cold, but there's an evolutionary reason I'm not going to get into. So goosebumps occur. Not only that, but your blood vessels will also be stimulated by the sympathetic neuron, and it will trigger these blood vessels to actually vasoconstrict, literally translating to vessel constriction. So I'll draw that here. So we've got vasoconstriction of your blood vessels in your skin. That actually makes you appear kind of pale. That's why when you're cold, you appear kind of pale. Why are we constricting your blood vessels? Well, remember from the previous example, blood carries a lot of heat with it, right? And in this case, do you want our heat to get out of the body? No, you don't. You actually want the heat to stay inside the body. So what we do is we pull the blood away from the surface of the skin, trying to conserve that heat. So as the heat is coursing through the blood vessels, there's less getting out of the body. See how it's kind of pulling back into the dermis a little more? Very cool. So that is one thing that the hypothalamus will do, is it will trigger vasoconstriction of your skin blood vessels. Very cool. That's going to conserve some heat. However, that's not enough, right? That's not enough. We're not going to warm up just by pulling our blood away. The second thing that has to happen is, oh, my son is crying. Pause for a second. Okay, so as I was saying, that's not enough to warm our body up. So next, we actually need help from our skeletal muscles here. So here's a skeletal muscle I have shown underneath the skin. And normally, we remember that we can control skeletal muscle with what's called our somatic division of our nervous system. So inside of the spinal cord, there will be a lower motor neuron we just talked about that will come out and communicate to these skeletal muscles, right? And if we decide, right, consciously that we want to move it, normally we'd have a neuron up here, come talk down to this guy, and we'd contract it. But in this case, we remember from the previous example that skeletal muscle can generate a lot of heat. So it generates heat when we contract it, right? So this is kind of a helpful way to warm up our body to contract skeletal muscle. But think about it. Do we willingly shiver when we're cold? No, it's kind of automatic, right? So there's kind of this interplay of how does a voluntary system, right, a voluntary motor neuron get triggered automatically? Well, this is called the shivering reflex. That is when the hypothalamus decides, hey, we have a need for heat. So I'm going to send an interneuron, okay? Basically a neuron that we can't control again inside of the hypothalamus. It'll go through a variety of different channels and communicate directly with this lower motor neuron. He will involuntarily stimulate it when we're really, really, really cold, thus stimulating lower motor neuron to send its signal to then stimulate that skeletal muscle with that neurotransmitter. Skeletal muscle will begin to spastically contract, and that will be called, obviously, shivering. Okay, so that is how, in a way, something we can control voluntarily can get overridden by the hypothalamus if we need to. So shivering is going to produce some heat for us. So shivering, and I'm going to say more heat. Awesome. So let's say hypothetically we do that over and over and over again. We had the information come in, we're cold, we shiver, we get cold, we shiver. That's a reflex arc where we're getting information in and then motor information back out. We'll talk about it a little more in the next section. Last but not least, let's say we get out of the polar plunge. So now we swim up, we are out onto dry land, we're drying off, and we are good to go. So now Anatomy Man is happy, although he kind of looks weird right there. So what do we need to do? Well, we know as we do these things, we'll continue to be vasoconstricted, we'll continue to shiver. Eventually, the body temperature will rise back. Okay, so body temp rises. And eventually it will get back to our 98 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So we've shivered enough and now we're back to normal. Well, in that case, what we need to do then is do what's called a negative feedback loop, where we got too cold, we got warm again, and now we need to cut off the signal, right? So what's going to happen is the hypothalamus, specifically in the thermoreceptor region, so the thermoreceptors, both in the hypothalamus as well as in the skin, will basically say, hey, we're back at 98 degrees Fahrenheit, right? We notice that that's good. So it will actually cut off this response. We will stop vasoconstricting. We will stop shivering because we've now detected that we're back to normal. Now we cut off that effector response. Very good. Okay. So as I mentioned before, we kind of talked about some spinal nerves and cranial nerves. The next one, we're really going to go into the details of a lot of special senses, cranial nerves, and other connections to finish out our class. So at this point in the video, Gracie would like to say, well done for sticking through it. This is our last example where we're going to be talking about a person watching fireworks, eating popcorn, enjoying their lives. And there's a lot in ANP1 that will explain what's happening here. So the first thing that we need to know is that this dude's looking down, eating his popcorn, not aware of anything, but immediately, as soon as those fireworks start, boom, they go off, and immediately what happens? Well, his eyes are going to move upward to go look at them, right? This may have happened to you before. Say like you're in a class and you're writing something down and all of a sudden the door opened, right? And what did everybody immediately do? Move their head towards the sound that they heard, right? What's happening here? Well, there's a reflex going on we're going to look at in a second, but let's look at what the reflex arc actually looks like. So when we're talking about a reflex, in a way, this is an automatic response to sensation, okay? So what is happening here? Well, there's going to be some sort of stimulus on your sensory neuron, whatever it is. It could be a sensory neuron detecting sound, light, what have you. And we're going to immediately enter into the central nervous system. It could be in the spinal cord, like if we're doing a knee reflex, or it could also be like a eye reflex we're talking about, where it's actually entering into the brain and the cranial nerves. So after that, we're going to have an interneuron here in blue that's going to basically coordinate the motor output, which will be done by this black neuron here. This is some sort of motor neuron, and it's going to elicit an immediate response, okay? That response, as we mentioned, could be the kicking out of your knee, right? Because we're activating your quad. It could be activating a muscle in your eye to move it upwards. So that is a classic reflex arc. So let's talk about what it is exactly in your body when you're reflexively looking at a firework, because a lot of A&P hinges on this type of idea. So first off, we heard a noise, right? We heard the boom. That's what triggered the whole thing. So how do we hear? Well, if you look inside of your inner ear, sound waves are going to enter into that tube from your ear. This is called the auditory tube. Okay, we can label that here, auditory tube. Okay, also called the external acoustic meatus. When we come into here, we're going to vibrate because these are sound waves. This tympanic membrane, otherwise known as the eardrum, that is going to vibrate 3 ossicles, bones. I think of them as tiny popsicles, like ossicles. And these 3 ossicles, 1, 2, 3, the malleus, I'm just going to write M, the incus, and the stapes, will all start vibrating as well because the tympanic membrane is vibrating them. From there, that stapes is going to compress fluid called endolymph inside of this organ called the cochlea. The cochlea, we can remember, looks like a conch shell. That is how you hear. Just like a conch, if you put it up to your ear, you can hear the ocean, right? So as we make those vibrations, we will have those same exact hair cells that we talked about previously when you were bent over and you kind of feel where you're at in space. Those hair cells are going to bend. So I'll just kind of draw one here, and they're going to bend in response to those vibrations. From there, they'll send, once again, a neurotransmitter to a sensory neuron. Sensory neuron is going to travel back towards the brainstem specifically. So I'm going to go in here to the brainstem. Now, this neuron you've heard of before. This neuron is a part of the nerve called the cranial nerve number 8. That is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay? That is a type of cranial nerve because we're going into the brainstem. And from there, where do you think this information needs to go? Well, you can probably guess, we've learned about it before. We're going to send it up to the thalamus, right? The sorting center. From there, we're going to send it to a new structure we haven't talked about lately, and that's going to be this region of the brain. So this region of the brain, just generally speaking, is going to be called the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe of the cerebral cortex, so the outer part of your brain. Okay, now temporal lobe does several different things for you. The first one being it perceives, I'll say perceives sound. So we are processing our sound here, right? Secondly, we're going to also have memory stored here, and we're also going to have smell. So we're going to come back to that in a second. However, this is when we actually perceive what we're actually hearing, correct? We're detecting sound, we're sending it to the thalamus, we're perceiving it in the temporal lobe. But I told you a reflex is almost unconscious. It happens automatically. So what's happening here? Well, when we hear something, it's going to travel into the brainstem, and when it's loud enough especially to kind of startle us, what will happen is we're going to activate an interneuron, I'll just kind of draw it out right here, that will trigger another motor neuron, and this is going to be a part of your oculomotor nerve. Okay, so I'm going to label right here, this is cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor, I'll write that here, oculomotor, literally translating to eye movement. And this neuron, as you could probably guess, eye movement, is going to go out and connect with the muscles of your eye. okay? As well as two other nerves. It could be the abducens nerve. It could also be the trochlear nerve, okay? Cranial nerves, I think that's 6 and 4. You can go into more detail about the cranial nerves here. But know that this is kind of a reflex, right? Sensation in, interneuron communicating here, and then we're sending action potentials stimulating this muscle here to move the eye. So I'm just going to write eye muscles. And immediately we know kind of where that is, and we're going to move that pupil. So we are now looking up at the firework, right? So that is that reflex, right? Sensation in, interneuron, boom, immediately look upward, right? And then right after that, we perceive that sound. Very, very cool. All right, so let's go a little further into this. Now that we're looking at the fireworks, how do we actually perceive the fireworks, right? Like what's happening there? Well, we know any sort of thing we see is because there are light, photons coming in to the eye. So I'm just going to say light, and that is in a way a stimulus, right? So there's a stimulus of light coming into our pupil, specifically the opening of our eye. It's going to refract, do a whole lot of things, but the main thing is it's going to come in and hit the back part of the eye. This back part of the eye is called the retina. This contains sensory neurons that have photoreceptors inside of them, photoreceptors. So these are sensory neurons, once again, kind of detecting things, and they're going to detect what? Photo, that's light, okay? From there, this is going to travel down a nerve, okay, to the thalamus as always. This nerve is cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, and it's going to detect light, obviously. Sends it to the thalamus. From there, we send the information back to this lobe of the cerebral cortex. That will be right here, the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe. And that occipital lobe is going to detect sight, vision, okay? So I'll write that in blue just to keep it separate. This is going to perceive light, okay? That is your visual cortex, vision, okay? Very cool. So we have seen the fireworks. We have heard the fireworks. Now what else are we doing here? Well, we know that when fireworks go off, you not only see it, but you also maybe smell it, right? Because there's smoke coming out of it and you can kind of smell that burnt smell. Well, how do we smell? That's a great question. Well, those smoke clouds will have tiny little molecules inside of them called odorants. Quite literally meaning they contain an odor, right? Now these odorants will find their way into this big nose, if it's me, and it's going to follow into the nose, into the openings of the nose, and it's eventually going to get to this region up here. This region I drew in orange is going to be that olfactory bulb. Olfactory literally translates to smell. This is actually cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve. And it's going to have little projections inside of it, the dendrites of the neuron, that will be able to grab those odorants, those chemicals. When those odorants dissolve and bind to those receptors, that will send an action potential, as you can probably predict. So it's going to send an information back towards the thalamus, as always. That's how it works. Again, this is cranial nerve number 1. And from the thalamus, where's it going to go? You see that it goes to smell, right? So it's going to go to the temporal lobe for smell. Very fascinating. However, I want to mention a cool part of the brain here that we actually don't see because it's deeper. So I'm going to kind of dot a line where it kind of would be lying. It's right here. This isn't the temporal lobe. This is called the insular lobe. Insular lobe of the cerebral cortex. Now with the insular lobe, we detect some taste, and we also detect some smell here, and we also have core memories and emotional experiences stored here. So emotional experiences. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, because let me ask you, have you ever smelled, say like, for me, cinnamon or peppermint? If you were to think of those smells and smell them right now, what type of season of your life do you think they remind you of? Well, for me, they remind me of Christmas time when I'm like in the house and I'm smelling cinnamon and we're making peppermint bark or something like that. So immediately when I remember that smell, I can remember the memory attached to it. Why is that? Well, The insular lobe makes associations with multiple things: taste, smell, as well as memories, right? So we're attaching basically all of these, like we're stapling these ideas together, and we form a memory that's strongly associated with other sensations. Kind of interesting. It can also be a negative thing. Say if this person has PTSD from, say, explosions in Iraq, well, sometimes when they hear fireworks, they immediately go back to that memory of, oh man, I'm in a bunker and I'm about to die. So it can also be a very negative emotional experience because of that insula making that association. Okay. If you're interested, Pavlov's dogs, the psychologist, also did this, dealing with the insular lobe. We're not going to go into the details of that. Okay, so we know the insular lobe deals with those types of things. Now, I mentioned taste here, right? Taste. We also can taste things with our bodies. How? Well, we're eating popcorn right now. So I'm going to say popcorn. Okay, you got to eat popcorn while you're watching your fireworks. And as you bring the popcorn into your mouth, we've got a tongue. Okay, so obviously this is your tongue. And attached to the tongue is a variety of cranial nerves depending on which part of the tongue. We could have the cranial nerve number 7. That is going to be the facial nerve, so facial. We could also have the cranial nerve number 9. That's the hypoglossal nerve, literally translating to below the tongue. And we could also have cranial nerve number 10. That is the vagus nerve. All of these will be able to detect taste. How? Well, there are chemicals in this popcorn, very similar to the odorants in the smoke, that will bind to those dendrites of some of these nerves. And that nerve will, again, send its information back to the thalamus, and then we're going to go specifically to either the insular lobe for smell, or for taste, or we also can detect some taste in the frontal lobe. So I'm going to write frontal lobe here. And again, we are perceiving taste here. Perceiving taste. And we're also going to have a lot of other things with the frontal lobe as well. So we're going to come back to that. But again, these are through these 3 cranial nerves. Now, let me just point out the vagus nerve has a lot of other functions to it. The facial nerve does too. So the vagus nerve controls all of your internal organs via parasympathetic nerve fibers. And then the facial nerve can also communicate with a lot of muscles of the face. So you're noticing with the cranial nerves, I'm not going to go into the details of this, all the cranial nerves can be carrying just sensory information, like the vestibulocochlear nerve, sound and balance. It can just carry motor information, like that oculomotor nerve that I pointed out somewhere. Where did I point that out? This is getting messy. Oh yeah, this black one right here, cranial nerve number 3, right? So it's just carrying motor output, or it could be both, like the vagus nerve detecting some taste, also being able to communicate with internal organs. So that's a helpful hint with cranial nerves, whereas the spinal nerves always contain both sensory and motor. So if we go down to the spinal cord, like here, we're always going to have a nerve coming in. That nerve will contain both sensory and motor information. So we're going to have sensory going in. We're also going to have motor going out. Not so for the cranial nerves. It could be one of those 3. Very cool. All right, so we've tasted things. Now, as we taste things, obviously we need to chew that food up. That's very helpful. So if you look at the muscles of the mouth, of mastication, there's like the masseter muscle, the lateral pterygoid muscle. There's a lot of muscles around to help us chew. Now, in order to do that, we need help from certain cranial nerves. One such cranial nerve, actually not again, is the trigeminal nerve. I'm going to draw the trigeminal nerve here in black. So right here is going to come in, communicate with some of these muscles to help us contract them to chew. This is, again, cranial nerve number 5. This is the trigeminal nerve. Now, the cranial nerve number 5, trigeminal, also contains sensory information about the jaw. So say if you got your jaw broken, or maybe you're getting a cut inside of your jaw or your gums, the trigeminal nerve also contains sensory information that can go in and communicate with the thalamus as well. So the trigeminal is a part of that both category. Very cool. Okay, so we've seen things, smelled things, chewed things. There's a lot of stuff inside of here. Now let's talk a little more about the higher brain functions. I talked a little bit about some of them. Let's go into the details of the cortex. Let's start first with that frontal lobe. Frontal lobe I think of as in the front of your mind. All of the things that make you you is because of your frontal lobe. That could be, for example, personality. and decision making. Okay, personality, decisions, a lot of speech here, deep thinking, that type of thing. But I'm also going to mention movement. All of your upper motor neurons, you remember the very first part of this video? The neurons that originate up here go all the way down and communicate with lower motor neurons to go out and communicate with other structures like muscles, right? That upper motor neuron is located in the frontal lobe. So all of your movement is contained in the frontal lobe. That's all I want for the frontal lobe. If you move posteriorly, right here, we also have your parietal lobe. I mentioned the parietal lobe previously. This perceives all of your general senses. Perceives general senses. That is going to be your hot, your cold, your pain, your pressures, and your touch, as well as your proprioception, so where your body is in space. So all in all, look at all the lobes of the brain: frontal, parietal, occipital, insular, and temporal. There are 5. Very cool. Okay, so that was a lot, but remember, God made your body, and it's a miracle that you're even alive right now. So it's a joy to even be able to study this stuff. Now, before you go, like and subscribe to the channel, and then if you want more overview of A&P in general, I recommend this video next. Otherwise, if you're going into this course, here's my entire playlist for the A&P 1 course here, and then study tips, which I know a lot of people struggle with here.